and for years now has been lollygagging as a retired poet and writer. But thank God he's always willing to come to our workshops because he's always so wonderful. Welcome.
If I can manage my own slideshow, it'll be a divine miracle. I'll be excited. It'll be the first time in 20 years that I've done a slideshow, so we'll see if it works as planned. I'm going to put on my bifocals, which, as some of you, those of you who are familiar with the back cover of the classic Method in Theology, this is the very frame type that Lonergan was wearing in that photograph on the back of Method in Theology, which Paul Kidder pointed out to me when I got it made. I hope I can use them. It'll work. So about a month ago, I was talking with our friend Pat Brown, who Lonergan scholar who lives in Hawaii, and he asked me if I was coming to the workshop this year, and I said, yeah, I'm going to write a paper on poetry. And he said, you know, when I first went to BC and I was taking my first course with Lonergan, and I came there from Seattle to study with him, and I would sit in the very middle of the front row, right in front of him, and of course I didn't understand hardly anything. And one time, a few weeks into this course I was taking, he said, I'll just swallow my embarrassment and ask the question. And he asked Lonergan, what is self-transcendence? And he said, Lonergan said, it's what happens when you read a great poem. So I thought, okay, it's a good thing to be talking about poetry. It was a good imprimatur. So this paper is, wait, let me make sure I can move my slides. This paper is an homage to Fred. Fred, who is to borrow a phrase from Vogelin, I think, when he's talking about his friend Robert Heilman, Fred is the constant silent partner of my thought when I'm trying to figure stuff out or figure out if I'm acting appropriately. You know, what would Fred do? And then I find I'm doing the opposite, of course. And so Fred is right now thinking, don't blame me. But for decades, Fred has been one of the embodiments of who I think of as incarnate meaning, who I think of as an existential role model. And it's been an invaluable gift, so thank you. He invited me this year to speak about poetry as conversation, and I wondered, how can I do that in a way that honors both him and Lonergan? And what I decided to try to do is explain, using Lonergan, why it is that I spent so much of my life reading poetry and trying to write poetry long after having discovered that I had small talent as a poet or literature specialist. And looking back after all these years, I think, to put it succinctly, that I fell in love with and stayed in love with poetry because from early on it became, for me, a privileged way to experience a sense of communion with sacred reality. Later I found that other types of art offered me such experiences as well, paintings, sculpture, film, music. But for me, poetry came first, and it remains central, and I'm going to try to use Lonergan's philosophy to explain why. The Lonergan part here, by the way, is not incidental. I had to study philosophy for a good while before I found a satisfying way of interpreting for myself what had been going on between me and poetry. My love affair with it, for which I recall a very definite beginning, a kind of poetry conversion moment. It occurred in 9th grade, the first year that a play of Shakespeare was assigned to me in English class. The play was Julius Caesar, and one assignment was to memorize a speech from it, which everyone had to write out the next class day from memory. It was like 25 lines. It was a major assignment. In the process of memorizing those 25 lines, to quote Joseph Heller, something happened. My character, for lack of a better word, was jolted. For 4 or 5 years before that, math had been what I was fanatical about. And my mother was delighted because I was going to do something with math and make something of my life. And then in 9th grade, I had this shift, and suddenly my North Star wasn't math, it was poetry. My mother was horrified. One aspect of this reorientation was my discovery of something that Lonergan mentions early in Method. He writes, "While ordinary language is transient, literary language is permanent. It is the vehicle of a work, a poema, to be learnt by heart. While ordinary language is elliptical, literary language not only aims at fuller statement, but also attempts to make up for the lack of mutual presence." Regarding Lonergan's first point, this was when I suddenly grasped that, as Ezra Pound put it, literature is news that stays news. Regarding the issue of mutual presence, I began to realize then that poems could be vehicles, as Lonergan says, for meeting authors as persons, appreciating the values they represent, and allowing one's living to be challenged at its very roots by their words. In addition, I became aware that poems could evoke the presence of what Lonergan elsewhere calls the something more that this world reveals, the ulterior presence that cannot be defined or got hold of because it is a sacred mystery. Briefly put, this poetry conversion event was the beginning of my discovery, my serious discovery of what art could be and do. Lonergan's account of art explains this eloquently. First, he notes, art speaks through symbols, through images that are dense with multiple meanings and richly evocative of feelings. The artist unifies certain symbols in patterns of internal relations whose rhythms, balances, proportions, tensions, and recurrences echo the ordering of the cosmos. An artwork is a concrete pattern of images that make up a unity that at its radiant best produces a sense that the artwork had to exist, a sense of the inevitability of form. Second, as Lonergan says, the symbolic meaning of the work of art is immediate. Its meaning and its embodiment are indissolubly one. The meaning of Beethoven's 7th Symphony is Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Conceptual interpretation of its meaning is not its meaning at the elemental level at which the artwork itself communicates. An artwork is created through insights, indeed, and is appreciated through insights, but these insights are more compact and immediate than insights in the intellectual pattern. They're insights that are able to convey an excess of meaning, as Gadamer says, through their compactness and affective power. Third, artworks are liberating. They liberate us from disenchantment, from dehumanization, from the narrow aims of practicality, from the strict verifications of science and math, from the numbing routine of living in a ready-made world. To what end is this liberation? Above all, to feel again the spontaneous joy of being gifts of free creative energy in the cosmos. To revitalize consciousness by returning it to wonder in its elemental sweep, and to let us explore our human freedom by discovering novel possibilities of perceiving and existing. Art achieves these ends not by inviting and enabling us to consider fresh possibilities of perceiving and being in a conceptual way, but by allowing us to participate in them. An artwork invites us to try out some experience. It's a concrete object that says, this is what human freedom is capable of. This is what human imagination is capable of. Now, taste and see for yourselves. The commanding form is offered as a painting, or as music, or as a poem, not in order for us to intellectually interpret it, although we might do that later, but in order to undergo the experience. If we don't do that, and do it at a preconceptual level of engagement, we've missed the point, missed the opportunity. This notion of undergoing or participating refers to an ontological, not just a psychological event. It means that we become one with the artwork, and in some measure with the experiences the artwork communicates. In other words, to some degree, one recreates in oneself the experiences that gave rise to the symbols that make up the artwork. In Lonergan's cognitional theory, he recurrently points out that the first stage in knowing is the Aristotelian identity, where the sensed in act and the sensible in act are ontologically one, and the intelligible in act and intelligence in act are ontologically one. If one truly participates in an artwork, oneself, one's whole self, is remaining at that moment of identity, that initial stage of knowing. As Lonergan puts it in Topics in Education, the subject in act is the object in act at the level of elemental meaning. It seems defensible to refer then to acts of aesthetic self-transcendence, in which one becomes the form or the beauty, which is the pattern of meaning objectified in the artwork. Like all acts of ontological participation, this may be articulated in terms of a logical paradox. For example, like this. In an act of aesthetic self-transcendence, the subject's longing for beauty is simultaneously a being one with the beauty that remains longed for. This is the paradox famously articulated in a poem by the haiku master Basho. Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's cry, I long for Kyoto. Hopefully that works as a symbolic evocation of the paradox that I'm talking about. Fourthly, and finally, the most significant function of art is to open us to the divine mystery in which our own openness originates, to make explicit our participation in the human divine in-between. As Joe Flanagan says, hidden in our everyday world, there is a splendor and mystery manifesting the divine, and art opens us to specifically transcendent feelings and values when they are given adequate symbolic expression by the artist. Or in Lonergan's words, the fundamental meaning important to us in art is that just as the pure desire to know heads on to the beatific vision, so too the break with the ready-made world heads on to God. I like to point out too, because in our day it's so easily overlooked, that the best art can carry us toward God because the divine partner was also at work, after all, in the process of artistic creation. The pure non-conceptuality and emotional immediacy of music have led some to argue that among all the artistic media, it has the greatest power to evoke a sense of divine mystery. It could be argued, though, that for the purpose of communicating complex, detailed, and nuanced truths of human participation in the divine, the strongest advantage belongs to art forms that combine the infinitely nuanced precision of verbal meaning with verbal musicality. So, poetry might be considered, and historically was long considered, the finest differentiated artistic instrument for this task, because it combines the power of verbal symbols with musical shape. By musical shape, I mean sounds that exploit the symbolic dimension of words by means of rhythm and meter, external and internal rhyme, assonance and alliteration, distribution of hard and soft consonants and long and short vowels, arrangements of stresses and pauses, and so on. In great poetry, this musicality can be felt to be exactly what is required by the connotations and the resonances of the word symbols. And when such a union of symbolic and musical meaning in poetry does in fact carry a strong sense of the inevitability of form, along with a sense of the transcendent, it offers a perhaps utmost symbolic reconciliation of richness of suggestion, precision of meaning, and wholeness of impact. This, anyway, is what I remember poetry doing and being for me, starting with that moment when it suddenly revealed its powers to me in 9th grade. I fell in love with musically worded form bodying forth inexhaustible elemental meaning. And as the years went by, I was increasingly interested in poetry whose explicit subject matter was the splendor and mystery of the world's participation in the divine. Tom Stoppard, our greatest living English language playwright, once said in an interview that he would be happy to have never written his plays if he could have authored a single one of Shakespeare's sonnets. Why would he say such a thing? I think because he views the genius of poetry as the genius of verbal perfection, the highest perfection in the use of words that humans are capable of. He may have considered something like this: since human beings are embodied logoi, worded incarnations, the best poetry may be the most concentrated essence of humanness there is, apart from the incarnate meaning of persons. Nevertheless, in our culture at large, despite the available presence of Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Virgil, Horace, Dante, Rumi, Shakespeare, Donne, the Tang Dynasty masters, the haiku masters, Whitman, Dickinson, Yeats, Rilke, Eliot, and the list is endless, the sentiment abounds among the serious-minded, at least in my experience, that reading and writing poetry is in the end just playing around. After all, the world's business, not to mention philosophy and theology, need to get done. Do we really have time for poetry? This sentiment and the idea that engagement with the world's poetic legacy may be a waste of time are partly, I think, a result less of the lousiness of most contemporary poetry than of the centrifugal scattering of the products of differentiating consciousness. Historically, it's a very recent development. It's only over the last 100 and 150 years, somewhere in there, that poetry has migrated, at least in the West, from the center of culture to a far margin. By now, most of us have simply grown alien to the poetic use of words, except perhaps, especially for many of you, in liturgical settings. It seems as difficult for us to feel at home in the poetic now as it is to find our way into ancient mythic consciousness. Both of these facts are related to contemporary disenchantment, and people do, after all, die of disenchantment. William Carlos Williams writes in his poem, Asphodel, That Greeny Flower, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." What is this news? For example, the news that existence is a radical gift, a gift of emergent, ecstatic, originating freedom. The news that grief also is love. The news that a person is a pilgrimage to a destination where a story begins. The news that truth is beauty. The news that character is destiny, that ethical life is tragedy, that spiritual life is a commedia. I didn't understand any of this in 9th grade. I felt my way forward, constantly having much poetry go over my head, as a lot of it still does. The great poets, after all, being much farther up the mountain. But I keep returning to poems, both familiar and novel, in order to experience a communion with intensely needed images that remind me of the real news. Poems that invite us, for example, to remember that every person is existence in the human divine in-between, which Emily Dickinson once compressed into this quatrain. The infinite a sudden guest has been assumed to be, but how can that stupendous come which never went away? There are poems beloved over centuries because they express key episodes in the drama of spiritual existence. There's an anonymous poem from the 14th century anonymous English poem from the 14th century. It's a short poem that addresses a key episode in everybody's spiritual drama. It needs there's a couple of words that need translation in it. The word to clape means to call, and the word thole means wait. So this poem goes, Lord, thou clapedest me, and I not may answer thee, but wordest slow and sleepy. Thole yet, thole a little, but yet and yet was endless, and thole a little, a long way is. I remain, then, an advocate for the practice of reading existentially valuable poetry, and Lonergan has important advice about how to engage in this practice, which I'll summarize, and then with his advice in mind, we can look at a couple of poems, short poems. First, as Lonergan reminds us, a poem is not autobiography. It's not the telling of one's personal tale. It's not the subject saying, look at me. The personality of the poet is not the point. As T.S. Eliot famously wrote, the progress of the poet is a continual surrender of personality to something more valuable, an escape from personality through successful artistic expression of self-transcending meaning. Second, as Lonergan tells us, it's a mistake to approach a poem in the intellectual pattern of experience. A poem isn't a puzzle to be solved, but a meaning to feelingly undergo and become. One's intellect and memory are in play, of course, but doing what? Attending to patterns of symbols while appreciating how they make a cosmion of mutually resonant relations. That is, how they make an integrated wholeness, an integritas, with nothing needed and nothing extra. A harmony of interrelated parts, a consonantia, and a radiance, a claritas, where words and their patterns sharply illuminate what they evoke. Third, one needs to accept the multiplicity of meanings in the words and give one's emotions full play by allowing the symbols, the musicality of the words, and the arrangements of words all their resonances of feeling. Fourth, in greeting the poetic experience, one needs to stay open to the possibility, this is something that's tricky for a lot of people in the contemporary world, that the poet may have had experiences more perceptive, considerate, loving, and visionary than one's own. And finally, one needs to stay ready to delight in fresh word uses, strange image clusters, intertwined metaphors, unusual syntax. And by doing so, to rediscover the mystery of language itself in the freedom of consciousness and in the human freedom with words. So here's a poem by the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas. It's an elegy for a child who has perished in a fire. But this particular elegy announces in stately language that it is a refusal to mourn for the high reason that the mystery of death is a holy matter of transfiguration. Never until the mankind-making, bird, beast, and flower, fathering and all humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking, and the still hour is come of the sea tumbling in harness, and I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead and the synagogue of the ear of corn. Shall I let pray the shadow of the sound, or sow my salt seed in the least valley of sackcloth to mourn the majesty and burning of the child's death? I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other. My own response to this poem, in part, is this. Thomas's openness to death's mystery carries my openness with it, so that I feel the dignity of the girl's existence, and Thomas's, and my own, and everyone else's. The poem turns no one away. Although it concludes with a statement, this statement is not a philosophical position. At least, I don't think we should take it as that, but rather the expression of an experience we're offered to try out. To me, the poem links all humans to each other and clarifies that what unites us is our being unique persons who each proceeds in existence through death to life. And it reminds us that humans are capable of a vision that transcends death because every person is an ongoing participation in the divine being beyond death. So if this works, I'm now going to play for you Dylan Thomas reading this poem. And if some of you are familiar with Thomas's extremely old-fashioned to our ears, oratorical, plummy voice, you might not like it, but on the other hand, it can sound like the voice of God if you're open to it. So we'll see if it works.
Mankind making, bird, beast, and flower, fathering and all humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking, and the still hour is come of the sea tumbling in harness. And I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead, and the synagogue of the ear of corn. Shall I let pray the shadow of a sound, or sow my salt seed in the least valley of sackcloth to mourn the majesty and burning of the child's death? I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other.
And finally, I'll conclude with excerpts from two poems by William Carlos Williams, the 20th century American poet, chosen partly because their diction is such a complete contrast to that of Thomas, give you a different kind of poetry. Williams's poetic diction is meant to sound like the idiom of everyday American speech, but its simplicity can be deceptive. The first excerpt is from a poem called Deep Religious Faith, and the pronoun it. Is it a pronoun? Yeah. The pronoun it in this excerpt refers to deep religious faith. And it's a poem that suggests that it is love which creates all and is beyond all that makes every human act come true, as he puts it, in the sense of come right. Past death, past rainy days, or the distraction of ladies' smocks all silver white, beyond the remote borders of poetry itself, if it does not drive us, it is vain. Yet it is that which made El Greco paint his green and distorted saints and live lean. It is what in life drives us to praise music and the old, or sit by a friend in his last hours. All that which makes the pear ripen or the poet's line come true. A second excerpt, which I'll close with, is from a poem called The Mental Hospital Garden. We're in New Jersey, where William spent his life practicing as a medical doctor. That was his career. In the garden of a hospital for patients with mental illness. And the poem reminds us that every person is a presence of spirit and love that transcends disturbances in underlying manifolds. A fact that the patron saint here, St. Francis, like all saints, is continually trying to teach us. It is far to Assisi, but not too far. Over this garden, brooding over this garden, there is a kindly spirit, brother to the poor, and who is poorer than he who is in love when birds are nesting in the spring of the year? They came to eat from his hand who had nothing, and yet, from his plenty, he fed them all. All mankind grew to be his debtors. A simple story. Love is in season. And this sums up finally what I have to say about the experience of poetry as communion. It's far to Assisi, but not too far. Thank you.